Hey, what's up, guys? Since the first video got such a good reaction, I wanted to make another one to go through the details of how I track my vocals on the newest Nox Aeternum album. Obviously, the title of this video is 5 tips for recording metal vocals using stem mixing. Of course, everyone nowadays has to make a video with a number in it, so it's extra clickbaity, and I guess I'm no exception when trying to beat the algorithm. If you like what you hear, like and subscribe to the channel, comment, add Nox Aeternum to playlists, tell your friends, all of that stuff. It helps me out big time when you share this with others, so I appreciate it very much. Also, go buy the album when it comes out next Friday. As always, if you listen until the end of the video, you'll find a link to the second single. So first off, let me start by saying I'm using a really old Acer computer with not the best specs. So for me, resource management is always an issue. Because of that, I started using stem mixing on this release because I didn't want to be limited to a certain number of plugins, and I didn't want my computer to sound like a nuclear reactor that was about to go off. It's really annoying to me when you're trying to mix and the audio starts to crackle and crap out on you. If you're unfamiliar with the term stem mixing, all that means is that I track each instrument in a separate session to get the general sounds that I want. Then I print it and bounce the track or tracks to the master session where I do the final mixes. Specifically with vocals, I do all of the delays and reverbs as separate stems when I bounce the audio down, which just gives me more control over what happens in the final stages because it's a unique track that I can play with. Stem mixing is one of those things where it's a great benefit, but it can also be a workflow killer if you're not careful. The benefit is that it forces me to commit to the sound of an instrument, which reduces the amount of time that I spend tweaking and screwing around. But the drawback is if I want to make fundamental changes later on, then I have to go back, change it, reprint it, re-import it into the master session again, plus it takes time to load each of those sessions and bounce between if I make a mistake. So really that just means that my mistakes are more painful to correct. While tracking the vocals, I used an SM7B, this guy, which is a dynamic mic. It's pretty great for singing and screaming, and it's affordable, which is great. And I really like it much more than any of the other condensers that I've owned for my voice in particular. So I sent that directly into my Scarlett interface, and that was pretty much it. I didn't do anything special to the room or the environment or compress on the way in. Maybe I'll do that in the future if I can afford some outboard gear, but for right now, I think the result is fine. So I didn't treat my space at all or use a mic shield or isolation, which I realize is not ideal, but I find that when I track vocals, I really like to move around the room. It just helps me get in the right mood and get a better performance rather than just standing in front of a room microphone on a boom stand staring into a studio foam or something like that. Here's the mix in the first stem, which is how everything sounds with the vocals before they're printed in the final stem. And you'll notice it doesn't sound as full or exciting, but that's why I'm showing it to you. We'll compare later to the end result. Now just the vocal track.
My soul is cleared the sage, siphon through the hard intestines of damnation.
As you can hear, there's a lot of reverb and delay that I'm peppering in. If we look at the outputs, the sends are going into a left and a right delay, one at 300 milliseconds and the other at 500. And then both of those are panned hard left and hard right. Now, I only punch these automations in for certain spots like longer screams or certain syllables that I want to accentuate. It adds a nice dimension to the voice, even if you don't really hear it when everything else is playing. And from there, I send those delays into a stereo group channel with a reverb on it. And I'm only using this a little bit just to soften the syllables of the delays so they don't distract from the main vocal, but it still gives a nice whoosh on the more intense parts. I mean, I gave this idea to Devin Townsend many years ago, and now for some reason he uses it on everything he does. Here's just the wet portion of the vocals, which is only delays and reverbs. So I'm sure you can probably hear that stereo delay in each speaker popping in on certain syllables. That's the automation. One other thing here, I rarely track double screams. I think I only did that maybe once or twice on this whole album. And I know some vocalists do this all the time and they really like that sound. But to me, I think it's way more brutal when one vocal is right in the center, right in your face. You can really hear the detail of the phlegm in my throat rather than a pan sound on each side. I also really prefer delay over reverb because it doesn't wash the vocal out too much, but that's just my personal taste. I didn't end up using as much reverb in the final stem because it washes the words out a little bit too much for me. The final two sends are just regular reverb and a tape delay. The tape delay is set at an eighth note, which is pretty quick, and it gives a little bit of flutter and a lo-fi thing that I thought filled things in pretty nicely. Here's what the tape delay is doing. All right, here's the main vocal track, which I'm processing with this chain. I use maybe some other little things here and there in specific sections of songs, but I'm not giving away all of my secrets today. First, I'm just hitting it with the SSL for some EQ. I'm high passing, adding some highs, some high mids, and cutting some boxiness. Then I'm hitting it with the CLA 76 in Bluey mode, and I'm really just compressing about 25 to 30 dB. It's a lot, because remember, I didn't compress on the way in, so this just keeps the volume and the intensity up and keeps everything audible against everything else in the mix. Then I'm EQing it again, more or less doing the same moves, but this time I'm cutting around 4K because I hate that frequency. Then I'm using a de-esser to take away some of the sibilants and the S vowel sounds. Then I'm just touching it with a limiter, and this thing is only doing about 2 dB of gain reduction in the very loudest parts. It's just keeping everything even so it's not poking out way above the cymbals and everything else. And finally, I'm using some console saturation in Nevo mode with the NLS. This thing emulates hardware, so it warms up the vocals a little bit and adds harmonics. I use this really on most tracks, even if it's not adding gain, because it emulates a piece of hardware and helps gain stage the mix and glue everything together. I hear a lot of people complain that digital recordings sound bad or not as good as analog, but in reality, digital recording doesn't have a cutoff point in the frequency spectrum that human beings can hear. So the reason that we like listening to what is referred to as analog is because every time you pass a signal through a piece of hardware, like a mic pre, an amp tube, a converter, a console strip, an ADAT tape, it adds some harmonic content to the original signal. Back in the day, when bands only recorded on analog gear, those pieces of gear would not reproduce the signal as accurately, and the makers of that gear knew it. So they would build them to add harmonics back in to make up for the limitations of the hardware. So nowadays, we refer to that as color. So anyway, this is my way of adding color for right now. After this vocal chain, I bounce everything down into my master file. The wet effects are bounced into separate channels below, and I do that so I can further automate the levels if I need to. The last stem is more or less just finishing touches. Okay, so the first thing I have here is the send, which if you remember from the first video is going to the guitars bus, and that pushes down the guitars just a smidge to make sure that the vocals ride a little bit on top of the guitars. Then I add a few more basic things to the main vocal, which is just to get it to sit the way that I want it to alongside the second stem of everything else. This is pretty simple. Another de-esser pulling out more S syllables. Another EQ shelving in a little bit more presence. The SSL really doing the same thing, and it's high passing again, just in case any of that compression pushed the lows back up from the first stem. And this just helps keep things clean so it doesn't eat into my headroom when I go to master. So if we compare the old stem to the new one, you can really hear the difference. Here's the original. And here's the final stem. Obviously, the final stem sounds way better. And no, I did not put any compression or mastering on the mix bus. You're just hearing each of the treated instruments all in one place compared to all of the untreated, unleveled signals at once. So here's a quick summary of today's tips. Tip number 1, get a computer with good specs. You don't need great gear to get a great sound, but if your computer's dying on you, you're going to be frustrated and not inspired to keep learning. Tip number 2, do most of your processing in your first stem. Use the second stem to do final touches and leveling. Things like side chaining can really wait until the second stem when you want the ability to tweak on the fly. Tip number 3, bounce anything that you might want to adjust later, like vocal delay or reverb as separate tracks. This just gives you maximum flexibility. Tip number 4, volume automation is your friend in the final stem. This is especially helpful on delays and reverbs and even sometimes on drums. Tip number 5, console saturation and analog modeling will help you gain stage. I recommend trying to activate it on all instruments and not just vocals. Even when it's on, it's working, even when you can't hear it, but don't overdo the saturation if you use it. And with that, that's really all I have to say about it. So go crack open a cold one, listen to the next single at the end of the video, comment, like, subscribe. Put this in a playlist on YouTube and Spotify. Tell all your friends, promoters, all the local radio stations, all that stuff. It helps me out big time. Enjoy the single and take care.